reconvene and go in public now for the previous in-camera session, and we're still looking at proceeds of crime, money laundering, and terrorism financing statutory review of the Act. And we have two witnesses with Academy Bitcom, Mr. Hamill, who's president, and as an individual, Mr. Mercan, broker of record with Max Realty. And gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. As your clerk made you aware, we're doing this study on money laundering and terrorism financing. Floor is yours. I believe each of you have a presentation to start with. I'm not sure. Go ahead, Mr. Mercan. We'll start with you. Mercan, we'll start with you. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. With the name of love, Happy Nowruz. The Honorable Mr. Speaker, Member of the House, good afternoon. Bonjour. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be at the Canadian Parliament, which is one of the most democratic countries in the world. I would like to wish each and every one of you a happy and full of love Persian New Year, the beginning of spring, which is tomorrow. To begin with, I would like to thank the Canadian judiciary system who provides its independency to prove their independency again and again. Without their fairness and the justice would not be served. Although I was up against two of the most reputable government lawyers paid by taxes, and they were right, I was an easy kill for them, but not on Canadian lands, thank God. My second appreciation is for the Canadian lawmakers who have implemented FINA to protect us Canadians and to make sure we do not let any terrorists nor their dirty, bloody money laundering enter into our society and economy, which I believe it is a fantastic law to protect us Canadians. This is the short story of what happened. I received my real estate license in 1989 and achieved my real estate broker license in around 2003. After working full-time in real estate for a number of years and have a good publicity with my surrounding communities, I decided to open my brokerage, which was the first Korean, Persian, Canadian real estate companies in Canada. At the time, my goal was to train the new immigrant in this field, and I was trying to attract investors into Canada, which I did. I attracted a lot of good, clean dollars to Canada, and at the end, making a decent living for me and my family. Up to 2009, I had trained about 138 agents, brokers, some of whom were collecting social services assistance from the government. At that time, I sold my house and bought a building where I was conducting my business from. A couple of months after FINA law became in effect for the real estate brokerages, I was visited by two government employees, FINA. After going through our paperwork, she told me that as a broker of record, one of your responsibilities are to catch anybody who looks like a terrorist. I looked at her assistant and asked her, does she look like one? She got upset. A few days after, I was served with $33,750 penalty. Yes, $33,750 penalty. After I complained about the fine, it was reduced to $27,000. Of course, my letter was very nice to them. Otherwise, the penalty would have been gone up or no reduction. On the other hand, I had to be careful when I'm mailing it, receiving it, not receiving it on Monday, because they might be upset with Monday. The name money laundering and terrorist activities was so scary that Real Estate Council of Ontario, RECO, decided not to renew my broker license, and it was put on caution. For 4 years, I lost my agents. I could not recruit any new agents. And eventually, I lost my business and my a new house of my business. I lost my office. Only my question is from the government, which is responsible to execute the law. A police officer has to go through months and months of training in order to execute the law, knowing that any mistake made by them may destroy someone's life, and there are the government regulatory bodies who are monitoring them to correct any mistakes made by them. If money laundering and terrorist activities laws is important law, which I think it is, what type of training is FinTrack offering to his employees for giving them the tool to destroy a lot of people's financial lives? If intentionally or unintentionally they do anything wrong, who can we take our complaints to, besides hiring a lawyer and spending a lot of money which you don't know where do they get? What type of training was FinTrack given to real estate brokerages to identify terrorists? At the end, with all due respect to the member of the House and my dear and favorite Prime Minister Trudeau, I'm sure you will soon notify FinTrack about the person's presence of Mohammed Reza Khavari in Canada, the man who has admitted to billions of dollars of money laundering for the Iranian government for harboring the terrorists in Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and the list goes on and on and on. In fact, all his achievements for the most activities terrorists in the world is in YouTube for everyone to see. I'm sure, Mr. President, you will soon direct FinTrack to pursue the yearly demonstration by Hezbollah in Yonge Street and Finch Avenue in North York. Last year, they were carrying all the black flag with Arabic word on them. Does it look familiar? And the major Canadian banks are their account holder of the million and billion of dollars of their money in there. I'm sure you will direct the FinTrack to check out the Iranian government officials who have double citizenship in Canada, and they're achieving the money laundering to Canada from Dubai, Europe, and everywhere else. At the end, my dear President, government, who is responsible for my losses now? Thank you very much for giving me the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Markham, and Mr. Hamill. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Then we'll go to questions.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, I am honored to be invited to this chamber as president of Bitcoin Academy, a consulting firm specialized in public blockchain technologies such as Bitcoin. We advise and educate businesses, institutions, governments, law enforcement, and regulators. From the outset, I would like to specify that my testimony will only refer to Bitcoin, the unit of exchange, and point-to-point payment technology. It is important to distinguish between Bitcoin and the various other cryptocurrencies in circulation. Bitcoin is considered by the industry and the North American regulators as a commodity-like asset, such as gold, and as currency-specific properties, such as divisibility, liquidity, transactability, fungibility. But let's be clear, Bitcoin is not a currency. Bitcoin is not also a security. But some other cryptocurrencies like Ether are more like securities, and the regulators are currently paying close attention. Other cryptocurrencies are downright scams like Bcash. You heard a lot about Bitcoin. We're going to the moon, free Lambos for everybody. But despite the seeming lightness of internet discussions and meme, Bitcoin is a serious industry that is developing at a fast pace in Canada, despite the lack of institutional support. The emerging blockchain technology sector powered by Bitcoin is currently attracting bright people from traditional finance, capital markets, and information technology sectors across the country. Hundreds of millions are invested from coast to coast by daring companies who see Canada as a fertile ground for developing this technology. For example, CoinSquare, a Canadian cryptocurrency exchange, has just raised $30 million and wants to hire more than 100 people in the heart of Toronto. Bitfarms, a publicly traded blockchain infrastructure company in Quebec, has just announced a $250 million investment in Sherbrooke, one of Quebec's largest private technology investments so far. The project will take advantage of the energy surplus of local producer Hydro Sherbrooke, enrich the community, and create 250 local jobs. Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, recently filed a patent application for technology to make credit information more transparent, credit information data more transparent and efficient using the blockchain. The benefits and potential of blockchain technology, which is widely discussed in the media, are not possible without Bitcoin. I'm going to repeat that for the record. Blockchain does not work without Bitcoin. Bitcoin got also a whole generation interested in market principle, finance, technology, and economy in general. To quote Mr. Christopher Giancarlo, chairman of the Commodity Future Trading Commission, we owe it to the new generation to respect their enthusiasm for virtual currencies with a thoughtful and balanced response, and not a dismissive one. Now, on the essence of the law that concerns this hearing, I would like to remind you that at the basics, Bitcoin is a decentralized technology that allows voluntary exchange between individuals. In itself, a peaceful principle and creator of prosperity in society. It is important to remember that most actors in the Bitcoin industry are actively collaborating with law enforcement, governments, and regulators, whether for educational purposes or in the development of a favorable and adequate legal framework for the development of this technology. The Canadian Senate dealt with these issues in 2014, and this is largely due to the wait-and-see attitude of the government, regulators, and law enforcement agencies that the blockchain industry in Canada has emerged. It is important to realize that cryptocurrencies and public blockchain technologies are a global phenomenon, and that actors and capitals are mobile. States are currently competing to attract major actors to a future economy that could reach nearly $10 trillion by 2020, according to RBC Capital Markets. Let's now address some preconceived ideas about Bitcoin. One, Bitcoin is not regulated. Bitcoin, like any means of exchange that can be used in society, Bitcoins fall under the aegis of various Canadian laws against fraud, money laundering, tax evasions, and theft. Using Bitcoin does not exempt you from the existing legal framework in Canada. 2, Bitcoin is anonymous. Bitcoin is pseudo-anonymous and not anonymous. The system is open and transparent to easily trade like cash, but each transaction is auditable and traceable on the blockchain. I don't know how criminal networks really work, but I'm pretty sure that archiving their transaction immutably and publicly on the safest database in the world is not a good idea. Additionally, peripheral players such as exchanges require a customer to identify themselves through a KYC, know your customer process. 3, Bitcoin is used for money laundering and terrorist financing. In reality, the use of Bitcoin for illicit activities is minimal. A recent study by the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Centers of Sanction and Illicit Finance states that less than 1% of transactions in the Bitcoin network are linked to illicit activities. In the recent hearings of Bill S-1241 at the U.S. Senate, Jennifer Fowler, Assistant Deputy Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crime at the U.S. Department of Treasury, said, although virtual currency are used for illicit transactions, the volume is small compared to the volume of illicit activity via traditional financial services. In conclusion, peripheral actors such as exchanges are able to deploy the security protocols required by the current law against money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities. It is not necessary to adopt Bitcoin and cryptocurrency-specific regulation. Canada is currently one of the most friendly places for the development of blockchain technology. Excessive regulation could challenge hundreds of millions of dollars in investment and kill an infant industry. Let me end with a quote from the Austrian economist and philosopher Ludwig von Mises. Innovation is the whim of an elite before it becomes a need of the public. Thank you for your attention. I am available to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we will go to 5-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to Jonathan. More so on Bitcoin, I'm going to very quickly, do we need regulation?
I think that the current legal framework pretty much cover any means of exchange, and I don't think we need a specific Bitcoin, a Bitcoin-specific regulation. Like I said, the Bitcoin in itself is not regulated, but
who's first up?
The peripheral actors that you use as a customer to enter or exit the network are licensed as money service businesses, and those companies are you are obligated to show your identity to transact, and they hold the records of pretty much all the transactions. So I don't think we need additional regulation than the current legal framework in Canada.
From what I read, I would probably disagree with that comment on you. Money services business, something like, say, Money Mart or something like that, a lot of them are regulated on a provincial basis and not on a federal basis, if I'm not mistaken. So you would need some oversight from the federal regulatory framework. And in terms of, like, say, a know your customer rule, that's completely different than just presenting your photo ID and proving your identity. So that's my comment there. In terms of what are the disclosure requirements for people participating in the Bitcoin market?
Some of the major exchanges like CoinSquare and Coinbase, for example, they use third-party services to authenticate the customers. So I would say that most of them use KYC process that would say are on par with traditional finance actors such as bank or insurance. So I would say it's pretty solid as a mechanism.
And veering a little bit. Obviously, your exposure to this is much more than just saying like a member of parliament, but in terms of financial innovation, where in your view is Bitcoin and Bitcoin technology, underlined by blockchain, if I have said that correctly, taking the Canadian financial sector and, for that matter, the worldwide financial sector?
Like I said in my presentation, it's a misconception that we can have blockchain technologies without native cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, because it's really the incentive that makes the system work. So real and revolutionary process that will be developed on blockchain technologies really need public blockchains like Bitcoin, for example. So I don't think we can have one or the other. Both are needed to foster innovation. And we see many interesting use cases, for example, in the supply chain industry, where we can trace the authenticity of drugs in emerging markets, whether it's for capital markets to move funds. It's probably hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars that could be saved for companies in Canada on an annual basis.
And also my understanding, one of the advantages of using Bitcoin technology is that the data integrity or the security of the actual transaction is very, very high. Is that correct?
That's very correct. In terms of security, Bitcoin use the same cryptographic algorithm than standard internet protocols, which is 256 bits encryption. To crack just one Bitcoin account, you have as many chance as guessing the winning combination of the Powerball lottery 9 times in a row. So it's pretty solid as a technology. Storing data on the public blockchain like Bitcoin is enforced through a mechanism we call proof of work, mining. This is why Bitcoin mining is essential to store and enforce the authenticity of data. So that's why to develop, I would say, revolutionary mechanism built on blockchain, you need mining, and you need actors like Bitfarm in Quebec.
Just to finish that comment off about the security integrity, on the flip side, that's why you would need a robust oversight. So if individuals, or organizations, or enterprises, be they may, are using Bitcoin technology for something that we would not want to use them for, whether it's, say, terrorist financing, money laundering, or so forth, you would need the authorities to have the proper tools and oversight and robustness within the system to be able to obtain the data that they would need to use, or look at the transaction that they would be able to use. And that's what I would argue for, is to have that robust oversight and regulatory oversight over that system.
Yeah, well, the data in itself, some of the most interesting use case will rely on the open and transparent nature of the blockchain to read data in an open way. But in terms of access, you cannot crack modern cryptography, and I don't think the government of Canada can, and nobody in the world can crack modern encryption, and Bitcoin is no different from that. So you probably saw the authorities in the U.S. that are trying to unlock phones, for example, from criminals. It's the same principle here. Modern and strong encryption is essential for individual liberties.
Okay, thank you. I got a dumb question, but where does Bitcoin reside? Like
physically?
Yeah, like I have difficulty understanding something I can't touch. Like I like to be able to touch a dollar bill. We can't do that anymore. They're a $5 bill.
Yeah. So
So explain that to me.
yeah. So it's one of the big misconceptions we have about Bitcoin is most of the article we see or we read always displayed a physical coin, but there's not much of those coins around. So Bitcoin is the coins are just an abstraction. Bitcoin, the network, is what we call the peer-to-peer network. So instead of having a centralized server, like for example Google or Microsoft, it's a network of thousands of computers that are all connected together. So that's why the network is safe and is also immunized from political censure. So you cannot physically pinpoint all the location of the network. Speaking of which, the location of the Bitcoin are stored on what we call the blockchain, which is the open public ledger. Think of an accounting ledger. All the Bitcoin transactions since day one are stored on that open database, stored on thousands of computers across the world. So one of the major properties of that network is that all the transactions are completely open and transparent for audit. So that's a new paradigm for of course, public finance could benefit from that.
Thank you. Mr. Albus.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank both our witnesses for being here today and sharing some of your understanding of the FinTrack as well as of the general systems that we are dealing with. Obviously, this review has important perspectives that need to be heard. I'll start with Mr. Hamill. Mr. Hamill, it seems to me that it seems more of a question of regulators' unfamiliarity with Bitcoin and with blockchain. It sounds to me like there is a number of ways to verify and whatnot. Do you think it's just a matter of regulators understanding this technology better? Absolutely. That's why we see organizations, for example, like Quensetter in the U.S., based in D.C., that are actively educating regulators. And we saw recently with the hearings at the U.S. Senate that most, like the SEC and the CFTC, are mostly open and adopting a wait-and-see approach because the technology is still in its infancy. There's a lot of media coverage about Bitcoin, but it's still small as an asset class. It's less than 500 billion. So I would say it's kind of disproportionate, the media coverage we see related to the total size of the asset. But definitely I would say that regulators are, there's a strong interest from the Bitcoin community to educate and to participate with the regulators. For example, I'm sitting on the FinTech committee at l'Autorité des marchés financiers, which is Quebec regulators, which is talking about cryptocurrency, but other FinTech subject. There is I would say, a strong interest, and that's an appeal to the community to participate and collaborate with regulators and law enforcement, like FinTrack, for example. So when the public looks at it, and obviously technology comes in different spurts and starts and whatnot, and as you mentioned earlier, there are different cryptocurrencies that are out there. Is this an example where Bitcoin itself and other related technology should be the starting point for Canadian regulators to look at as an example that they can work with? Because it seems to be there seems to be a lot more adoption of it than in some of these other cryptocurrencies. Yeah, I would say that I separate Bitcoin from the others because Bitcoin really has the properties of a commodity. First of all, there was never a price set for Bitcoin. It really emerged organically from the community, and there was no emission of Bitcoin. It was created on I would say on the internet, and it really grew organically. So there was never a launch like most of the cryptocurrency. For example, the second biggest cryptocurrency, Ether, was launched based on what we call an ICO, an initial coin offering. Now regulators are looking at those activities that are probably the emission of securities because they're raising capital to launch the technology. Bitcoin is different because it never raised money. It really grew organically, and adoption grew organically as well. And there was never a price set for the commodity. So it really behaves like a virtual commodity like gold. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your expertise. Mr. Merkin, thank you again for your presentation today. I'm really not looking to relitigate your case, so to speak, but I do have some questions because you have rightly asked who regulates the regulators. Obviously, FINTRAC is created under parliamentary statute, and there are avenues such as the court. So when you were issued a fine that you subsequently sought to have lowered and was successful at that, did you then take it to court at some point? Because that is the natural alternative for someone that disagrees with a government fine.
Yes, sir. I fought for 4 years. For 4 years, I went back and forth to the court. First, they asked me to hire a lawyer. I talked to several different lawyers, and they all told me that it's funny, we never heard of that. I mean, FINTRAC for real estate. Until I find one of the most reputable law firms in downtown Toronto. I took the case there, I gave them $10,000. Again, they called me in about 2-3 weeks, come and give me another $10,000. And then for 2-3 weeks after that, I called them to see what is happening. It was on the news, all over the news. They took the trust account and they closed down the firm and everything. And I went to the court and I said, you know, I told the owner, I said, money laundering terrorist activities is a big thing. I can't find a lawyer and I can't afford a lawyer. Send me to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
Okay. Again, I'm not asking to relay. I just wanted to make sure that you did have the option and you did try to have your day in court, but it sounds like you decided not to continue your case.
I did.
Based on it.
I did continue my case as far as I could.
Yes, okay,
as far
I understand.
As I could, but you don't have a lawyer going through federal court is not an easy
task. And that is a fair enough observation, sir. A lot of people have said that the cost of court makes it difficult for them to feel that they have their day in court, and so often they will not pursue it because of that. So, but again, I'm not here to relitigate your case. I'm here to understand, though, that those avenues were put in front of you. Now, when you said that originally someone came by and said that there were certain obligations that you as a brokerage at the time hadn't completed, was that, obviously I'm sure there are other brokerage firms that were able to get their work done. What particular issues did they take with your particular brokerage's records?
They checked some of our files. They said, you don't have FINTRAC officers, which I was FINTRAC officer and my brother was FINTRAC officer in there. But we came in the wrong side of each other because of when she asked me to pinpoint the terrorist, and I didn't know how important it is. And I looked at her assistant and I said, she looks like a terrorist, and she got upset. Everything started from there before the 4 years. But my problem is not, see, if I get into any problem with this gentleman, I need a court. But we're talking about the government. I mean, if you come and you have the power to destroy my business, there's got to be a body in the government I can go and talk to see what is going on. Not to hire a lawyer, go through the court to tell my government what is going on.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you had that, where you had that option there, sir, because I do agree with you that governments are given a lot, especially once Parliament makes regulations, or I should say makes law, and delegates it to an organization. They do have a tremendous amount, and I'm glad you got to share some of your story today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, before I turn to Mr. Dussault, just on this line of questioning, you mentioned, Mr. Mercan, that I think in the beginning that you felt there wasn't enough training on your side to deal with what you had to deal with. Am I correct in that you felt there was an obligation there on the part of government or whoever to ensure that there was training such that you would know as a real estate broker how to deal with this entity FINTRAC? Am I correct in that?
Exactly, Your Honor. I mean, before you ask me for anything, you have to train me, then ask me that if I did anything wrong. Where was the training? You just send an email. I didn't get it from the government. I got it from the franchise I was with at the time, Home Life, that there is a FINTRAC in effect, and these are the things you have to do. Not one of them wasn't that I have to catch terrorists. Why?
Okay, that leads me somewhere. Mr. Dussault.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je vais me tourner vers...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Amel about cryptocurrency. I do want to say that I am the member for Sherbrooke, so I just want to say that on my own behalf and on behalf of my riding members, and I hope that things go well with this technology in Sherbrooke, and that this will help develop other technologies. But I want to talk a little bit about other cryptocurrencies. I understand that there are others that are completely anonymous, even though Bitcoin is not. Yes, Monero, Zcash, and other currencies are completely anonymous, and so there is no trace of any transactions. Those are the kinds of currencies that are more likely used on the dark web, which most people don't really have access to. Those are the technologies used for illegal transactions as well, because there's no trace. So I think that's what we need to address as legislators, these technologies that are created for anonymous transactions. With respect to Bitcoin, are these transactions public? Could anyone look at this ledger and see the usernames and the transactions? Perhaps not first and last names, but usernames. Yes, these are usernames, a portfolio, or account names, so it's pseudo-anonymous. It's fairly easy to trace. The RCMP can identify an account belonging to a drug trafficker, for example, and might even be able to follow the network. So it's really quite easy to trace these transactions. We are starting to have self-regulation. For example, in Japan, there have been decisions made to stop allowing anonymous currency transactions. So to allow only a couple of kinds of currency, Bitcoin, which has a high rating, and other witnesses have said to us that to have access to Bitcoin and to actually trade it, you have to have a bank account if you really want to get the value in regular currency of the Bitcoin that you hold. So if you have a fictional user, that would be a problem. That's quite right. There is no direct link between Bitcoin and regular currency and financial institutions. There has to be an intermediary. Coinbase, CoinSquare, those are the types of players that require their clients to be identified. So what I saw in the money laundering legislation, that protocol could be implemented through those actors. And when you have exchanges of Bitcoin up to $3,000, for example, is the same thing as when you want to trade Bitcoin for US dollars. You have to identify yourself. What about reporting requirements? Banks have very high standards to meet under FINTRAC. But in your case, or in the case of Bitcoin, there is no central entity, and I understand that's the whole idea, that there is no centralization. But how do we ensure that when there might be suspicious transactions that a bank would have to report on because they might be related to criminal activity, how can we make sure that with Bitcoin, when there are such suspicious transactions related to criminal activity, who would be responsible for flagging them? Somebody that would say, oh, this particular transaction looks suspicious. I think that there is a synergy or coordination that could emerge between FinTrack and CoinSquare or Coinbase, these kinds of entities that would have sanctions related to them, so that if certain people opened accounts, there would be monitoring. So I think that peripheral entities, exchanges could be involved to make sure that the technology is not used to facilitate money laundering and terrorist financing. Bitcoin has always collaborated with legal and other authorities for these technologies. Thank you.
We are going to run into bells about 6:15, but we can go a few minutes after that. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, puis j'aimerais remercier nos deux témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank both witnesses. Mr. Amel, to begin with. I have a question that might be rather simple, but I hope you can answer me. Do you believe that digital currencies are used to launder criminal proceeds? Yes, but to a very small extent, as I explained in my presentation. And there, I am basing myself on the reports that some 1% of transactions would be related to criminal activity. I can say this because Bitcoin transactions can be traced fairly easily, and therefore people don't use these transactions for their criminal money laundering, etc., because they can be monitored. Therefore, only a very small number of transactions would be involved in illegal activity. I don't think that most of the cash would be involved in drugs and other illegal activities. So you're saying that digital currencies are as safe as regular money? You mentioned a percentage. You said 1%? Well, for example, the Undersecretary for Commerce in the U.S. said that that American currency is used a lot more by those that want to finance terrorism or conduct illegal activities. I just wanted to see exactly what you're saying here. You mentioned 1% of Bitcoin transactions involve suspicious activity. I'm talking there about Bitcoin. Mr. Dussault brought up the fact earlier that there are other types of digital currencies that are very anonymous, and so the numbers might be different for them. But Bitcoin transactions are quite traceable. It's quite easy, in fact, for police forces with the highly developed tools that they have now to do that kind of monitoring, the RCMP and different police forces around the world to do forensic investigations. So do you think that the anonymity should be addressed? I think that there is a consensual approach used, and there is a sort of immunity to any government intervention. But users of Bitcoin that use CoinSquare and Coinbase and other kinds of exchanges already are under this kind of system where there can be tracing of transactions. You mentioned this study And we have heard from a number of witnesses from FINTRAC, from the security side, to say that Bitcoin or digital currencies in general are a scourge in the system because much of the money involved is used for illegal activity or comes from proceeds of crime. So these experts are telling us that there's a problem, and you are saying that they are wrong? Yes, I don't agree with them because I think that pseudo-anonymity, which is the case for Bitcoin, should not be attacked in trying to deal with crime. I think that the authorities have all of the information that they need, and I think that those that are carrying out suspicious activities can be identified. Perhaps other measures could be taken to further identify them. If Canada were to increase its measures, we would have to look at exactly how this should be done. I think this might threaten the neutrality of the internet if Canada decided that Bitcoin users had all to be identified. Then things would change overnight. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hamill, thank you for your testimony. I want to ask about the intrinsic value of Bitcoin. Currencies have traditionally held their value because they've been backed either by a commodity like gold or produced by a precious metal like silver, or more recently just by the implicit taxation power of the government that stands behind that currency. Bitcoin has none of those things. Why should we believe in its intrinsic value?
Well, I think that the intrinsic value of Bitcoin, first of all, I will restate that there was never a price set for Bitcoin. So the value that you see today is really based on
market value.
On the market value. We always say, some economists say that gold is also a bubble, but a 5,000 years old bubble. I would say that Bitcoin has a value because people see utility in the network. It is secure. It is easy to transact. It is fungible. It is you can separate every subunit of Bitcoin to the 100 million of a unit. So in every aspect, it's a really good currency, but it's not in currency by definition. So you mentioned gold. I think the similarity with gold are really, really close. But I would say that the intrinsic value from Bitcoin really come from the market that values it. And I think it's a catch-22 to analyze Bitcoin with traditional financial paradigm.
The market determines the price. It doesn't necessarily determine the value. And I make a distinction between price and value in the following way. During the dot-com bubble, the price of stocks in companies that had no earnings or in some cases no revenue, the price was very high, and that was based on voluntary purchase and sale of securities in those companies. But the value obviously wasn't that high, and eventually the price fell to the value, and the bubble burst. Just because people are paying a certain price for Bitcoin doesn't mean it is worth that.
Yes, I would say that people were pricing a future internet revolution that probably a lot of the companies involved were not able to deliver. I would say the difference between the internet bubble and the actual cryptocurrency market is that the internet bubble was using a lot of leverage. There's no leverage in Bitcoin. It's pretty much an all cash market. So you cannot have a cascading effect of market crash and margin calls and people losing everything. That's why people in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are able to sustain 50, 60, 80% loss because they paid probably entirely cash their holdings. So that's a big difference with traditional markets. And I think we can safely say that the real internet revolution came after the internet bubble. Companies like Amazon went through it, and bigger companies like Google emerge afterwards. So probably that the multiplication of all coins, so coins that are copied on Bitcoin and launched through initial coin offering, which looks like pretty much scammy IPOs, are probably similar to the dot-com bubble. But we think that the true revolution will come afterwards, and yeah.
But at least during the dot-com era, you could speculate that one day these companies would turn a profit, which they would translate into dividends. So there would be some intrinsic. You could speculate on an intrinsic value down the road. Bitcoin doesn't even purport to pay dividends. Owning a Bitcoin will not pay you a dividend, unlike a share in a company that may one day profit. So I guess what I'm saying is, what is underneath Bitcoin that is valuable and therefore justifies the price?
First, there's a finite amount of Bitcoin. There's going to be only 21 million of Bitcoin. So kind of like gold, it's a safe asset. So it's funny to say that when we have 40-30% fluctuation, but it's still an early and young market. Probably in the early days of gold, gold price were fluctuating 20, 40, 50%, maybe in the 5,000 years ago. But we believe that in the future, Bitcoin will remain pretty much stable, and we think that I'm on the side of people that think that Bitcoin will become some kind of reserve currency, kind of like gold in the early 20th century, and maybe other cryptocurrency or other smart asset will be based on that finite amount. It's also one interesting properties of Bitcoin. Not only the finite amount is known, the rate emission through times is known. And in a chamber like that, in a parliament like that, having confidence in an asset that will deliver predictable inflation through time, I think it's pretty interesting. So people they have confidence in the Bitcoin protocol and the developer that actually sustain and maintain the technology.
Last is Barry Shortman.
Yes. I've heard economists propose that blockchain technology could be a solution to corruption, particularly for land registries in underdeveloped countries, because of the dispersed nature of the blockchain. It'd be very hard for a corrupt government official, for example, to switch a land title to a friend, family, or himself. Yep. Therefore, future property registries could go on the blockchain. I think Georgia has done that. Yeah, the country of Georgia, they did it. And you mentioned a really interesting use case. There's also a pretty cool, interesting use case with the traceability in the supply chain of medication. I worked in a few emerging markets, especially West Africa, where you can buy medicine in the drugstore, and the medicine you pick up from the shelves are counterfeited medicine. So you could use blockchain technology to trace and make sure that every actors in the supply chain, for example, sign with their own private key, and that data would be stored on the blockchain. And it's really the public blockchain, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain, which has the more, I would say, the more computer power behind it. And that's why it's hard to tamper with the data. There's billions of dollars involved if you want to tamper with just only one inscription. Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have permission to go to one more question. Okay, Ms. O'Connell. Two then. We'll agree in two, Pierre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for coming. Mr. Mercan, sorry, I missed it at the beginning. Which province did you say you operated in?
Ontario.
Okay, so were you ever a member of the Ontario Real Estate Association or CREA?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so then I guess you didn't realize that both of those organizations provide FinTrack training and your obligations within it?
No, I didn't know that.
You didn't know.
I didn't know that 3 months after this law came into an effect, and nobody even knew about it. They came and they audited us.
Sure. So do you feel that there are some obligation, because you weren't just a real estate agent, you were a broker, which means you're then responsible for other agents that worked for you. So you actually had a higher obligation to understand the laws within the jurisdiction that you operated in, just as sometimes tax policy changes, either provincially or federally, and it's your obligation to understand what those changes are and file your taxes accordingly, including when you do, for example, a real estate license, or when your agents would do their real estate license in Ontario. There are obligations. So you feel that for FINTRAC, the government has the obligation to inform you, but for things like paying your taxes and remitting the actual taxes or knowing any changes, that you understand your obligations as a business owner. But FINTRAC, even though FINTRAC works with the local, in your case Ontario, and the Canadian Real Estate Association to provide information to their members. Did you ever go to CREA or the Ontario Real Estate Association to say, how come you didn't provide me as a member with this information?
No, nobody knew about it at that time. Not even the franchisees, they knew about it. Nobody. I called RICO, I called Toronto Real Estate Board, OREA. Everybody were, people at the government level, they sit until somebody gets hurt and then they come, oh, it got hurt, now we have to do this. Okay. Nobody knew anything about it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hamel, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that Bitcoin and blockchain go together exclusively.
Yep.
I've heard otherwise. So can you maybe elaborate on why you feel that's the case?
Yes, there is, I would say there is some, competing networks that resemble some feature of the Bitcoin blockchain, for example. But the true nature of a blockchain is the fact that it's immutable. You cannot tamper with data. And to have that properties, you have to have true decentralization. So having a closed network without any incentive for participant to enforce consensus doesn't create the condition for a true immutable and decentralized blockchain. So in reality, most of the use case that these competing platforms try to address don't really need a blockchain. When you have a closed network of people that already trust each other, you don't really need a blockchain. So that's why public blockchain that are enforced by proof of work like Bitcoin are the true blockchain.
Okay, but I guess if we go back to the question by Mr. Polyev and the example of land registries, what does that have to do with Bitcoin? That's blockchain technology without the Bitcoin component. So in terms of, a type of technology that is highly encrypted and obviously has that benefit, I don't see how I don't see how they have to go together. In that one example, I didn't hear anywhere where Bitcoin was a factor in land registry in potentially corrupt
because most of these projects are fakes or scams, but the real interesting use cases will be based on public blockchains like Bitcoin. And in fact, the only way to write and store data on a blockchain like Bitcoin is by doing a Bitcoin transaction. But people now are actively developing second layer protocols. For example, Rootstock, that relies on the proof of work mechanism of blockchain to, for example, create smart contracts. So advanced technologies and advanced use cases like land registry and supply chain tracking could be developed on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So I think with respect that the real revolutionary blockchain use case will be built on public blockchains.
That's assuming, sorry, just to clarify, that's assuming someone can't replicate the blockchain that Bitcoin established.
Well, you can if you want. You can start today, but Bitcoin has billions of dollars of computing power behind it that enforce the consensus and the authenticity of transaction. So there is a network effect, kind of like the same thing that you don't want to create a second Facebook or a second Google. You can if you want, but there's a strong network effect to use the actual network.
We had time for 30-second question there, Pierre, and then we got to go around.
Thank you. I just want to come back to the fact that you said there were 20 million bitcoins and there's an increase of a certain amount per year. Who decided that, and can that decision be changed? Well, the initial decision was the introduction of Bitcoin that Satoshi Nakamoto decided on, and we don't know if that's an individual or a group, but the consensus to make any changes is unlikely to be achieved because since there has to be a consensus, most users work very rationally in their use of Bitcoin, and it would be irrational to, say, double the value of Bitcoin because that would devalue the Bitcoin that people already have. Would it be through a voting process? No. Now, some people say that the miners are the ones that control Bitcoin, but in fact, it's the users that vote, in a way, by their use. So if there is a change in that, and people change the use through a sort of this is very unlikely, in fact.
Fronts. Thank you, Mr. Marquand, and thank you, Mr. Hamill. We've got 7 minutes and 30 seconds to get to a vote. So meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.